Hey there, Christians. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that you have objective morality? Do you think that you know objective truth? And if you believe in objective morality and or objective truth, do you think that this morality and that this truth comes from your Bible? Thank you for joining us. This channel here is Skepticus. I am your boy, Adam of Nola. And today I'm diving into this topic because if you have been a part of any type of discussions between Christians and atheists, one thing that you commonly hear bandied about is this idea that Christians have objective morality. If you've watched any of the other videos on my channel, you may have noticed that this is something that I enjoy pounding on because the Christian idea of objective morality is anything but. Now, I'm not going to carry on with general platitudes here. I'm going to talk to you in specifics. In fact, we're going to go right into the core of what many Christians consider to be their so-called objective morality. That core that I'm talking about is the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments aren't the only example that a Christian would point to in trying to claim some kind of standard of objective morality, but they are something of the gold standard for Christian morals. Everything, it seems, kind of flows from the Ten Commandments. So that's why I wanted to start right there. Because if the Ten Commandments are not objective moral commandments, then it's pretty darn difficult to point to the rest of the book and tell me that this is full of objective morality. So we're going to go through these 1 through 10, and we're going to talk about whether or not they are objective or subjective or something in between. Now, just to set some quick ground rules here, I will, for the most part, be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV. It may not be the version that you are accustomed to reading. There's a lot of KJV only type people out there. There's a lot of people that read from the NIV. And I will mention different translations at just a few points in this discussion. But for the most part, I didn't want this to be some in-depth, deep dive into the vagaries of different languages and translations and doing a deep textual analysis. First and foremost, because I am not and have never claimed to be a biblical scholar. I'm really looking at this from the layman's perspective. So while I don't deny that there may be some deeper insights to be gained if you know the ancient Hebrew, and for the vast majority of you watching, you don't know it either. But really, to me, it's important to go through the English translation for most Americans or English speakers, because most of us cannot read the ancient Hebrew. Most of us don't know what it would say in the ancient Hebrew. And to a certain extent, if your holy text doesn't stand on its own in the language in which you read it, then it really shouldn't be translated into those languages at all. But that wouldn't make the ideas very transferable to the entirety of different populations. So again, starting at this with the NRSV, let's start right in with the first of the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Let's see, does that sound objective? Well, what does it mean to have no other gods before me? Now, I know the standard Christian translation of this idea. When I was growing up, it was basically a statement that said, there are no other gods before me, and you will worship no other gods. And there was a strong implication, as this was read to us in my church, that any other god that someone might ever mention is completely and entirely make-believe. But that is bringing a lot to the text that is not there. Quite frankly, the command part of this is very simple. You shall have no other gods before me. But again, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that you can't even acknowledge the existence of other gods? Because this commandment does not tell you that there aren't other gods. It just says you can't have other gods before me. And what does before me mean? Now, Dan McClellan had some interesting input on something related to this, where he talked about in ancient temples, you would have a statue of Yahweh, and there were supposed to be no other statues in front of Yahweh in the temple, or not even any other statues of any other gods anywhere else in the temple. This comes about because the early Israelite religion was not a monotheistic tradition. It was very much polytheistic. So it wasn't so much about, hey, I am the only God. In fact, if you wanted to say something about there being one God, you would probably refer to a verse that comes much later called the Shema. But I'm not going off into that now. The deeper point here is this. The idea of having no other gods before me is something far short of being objective. That doesn't even say definitively whether I can have other gods, but they just can't be before him, or whether the other gods even exist at all, or whether this is an implicit declaration of monotheism, which it doesn't seem to be. If you think that this is objective, let me give you a quick little anecdote. One of the times when I came back from India, my ex-wife, who was a devout Christian, saw that I had brought back a statue of Ganesh. It was a beautiful, carved, polished stone statue, handcrafted of Ganesh. She was very uncomfortable with this, and she and I had very different opinions on it. I was a practicing Christian at the time, and I said, we're not going to pray to it. We're not going to bow down before it. This is just a statue. It was very lovely art. She did not have the same opinion. But I bring this up because this speaks to the ambiguity of the first commandment. So I am definitely not calling the first commandment objective. This is absolutely subjective. The second commandment reads, "You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me." Now, setting aside the overall disgusting nature of that passage, I will actually be going into that in much more detail in a few weeks when I release my God-free Bible study episode that goes into detail on the 10 Commandments. But aside from that, the commandment here that we are concerned with is, do not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Now, I just gave you my story about coming back with the idol of Ganesh or Ganesha. And as I had already said, if you're not bowing down to it, if you're not actually worshiping the idol, to me, it was not a problem. My ex-wife, who was also a Christian, had a very different opinion on that. But in this commandment specifically, there is still a lot of ambiguity here. First of all, some people have taken this command to actually believe that you should not create images or any representations of anything that is in the heavens above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. I don't know of really any Christians that routinely take that view, but it is not an unreasonable view, just from reading this text alone, to believe that any representation of things that are in the heavens or on earth or in the waters is somehow in violation of this commandment. But the ambiguity here gets even murkier than that. When I was growing up, many times pastors would use this commandment to illustrate the idea that we should not make idols of anything. For example, if I were to go purchase a brand new Lamborghini, and no, I cannot afford anything close to a Lamborghini, but if somehow I managed to buy a Lamborghini and it was out in front of my house, and that was all I cared about, if I spent my entire day polishing it and I said, screw this, I can't go to church today because I have to give it a tune-up, and I ignored my spouse and my friends and my children because I just want to be in awe of my Lamborghini, and that was all I cared about, there is a reasonable argument to be made there that I am using that Lamborghini as an idol, that even if I don't physically bow down to it, I am emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually bowing down to it. I am making it an idol in place of God. All that being said, that is a pretty loose interpretation of the literal text itself. So whether or not someone is making an idol out of their car, out of their job, out of their favorite painting hanging on the wall, that is all incredibly subjective. And at what point my appreciation for this car crosses the line from being just someone enjoying his car collecting hobby versus someone who is truly violating the second commandment and making an idol out of this car, that line is the opposite of objective. It is purely a subjective judgment as to whether or not someone is truly idolizing the things around them. So I don't know how you could label this second commandment as anything other than subjective. The third commandment is, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Right away, this is pretty obviously subjective if it were for no other reason than the single word wrongful. What exactly is the wrongful use of the name of the Lord? If I stub my toe and absent-mindedly with blinding pain and anger yell out, "God damn it," is that the wrongful use? Have I violated the third commandment? If you don't think that's subjective, then you don't really know what the word subjective means. There are all sorts of ways to use the name of God, but whether or not every single one of them is wrongful is absolutely a subjective judgment call. If I use the name of God as I am about to go into battle, is that wrong? I think most Christians would say no. But what if I used the name of God as I'm about to step into a boxing ring, which is really a form of ritualistic stylized combat, but it doesn't carry with it nearly the same life or death circumstances that we associate with true battle? What if I use God's name in a scenario that to me seems joyous, but may not seem religious to you? What if I use God's name when I am in the throes of an orgasm? Is that the wrongful use of the name of the Lord? Again, that's damn subjective. And before we move off of this one, I always like to point out that so many Christians don't even seem to know what God's name is. What is the name of the Lord? When I was growing up, and for most of my first 30 or 40 years, I didn't even know what the real name of God was. I was always taught that God's name is God or Lord. But that's not God's name in the original Hebrew. I know I said we're not going to go too much into Hebrew here because I don't speak ancient Hebrew and you probably don't either. But one of the key things I've learned is that every time it says Lord in those all caps, that is a placeholder for the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton itself, Yod He Vav He, or as is commonly said today, Yahweh. So it is Yahweh's name that we're not supposed to make wrongful use of. In fact, if we read this without the polite allusion here to Lord, instead it says, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of Yahweh, your God, for Yahweh will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. So does God damn it qualify as misusing the name of Yahweh? Because the actual command as it was written down in the original ancient Hebrew does not say anything about misusing the word God or the word Lord. It talks about misusing the name Yahweh. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that most Christians think it's fine to say, God damn it. Most of them do not. Some of them think it's a grave affront to the Lord. Some of them think it's not cool, but it's a minor offense. But very few Christians think it's cool to say, God damn it. But really, if you read this command as it was originally written down, it says nothing about misusing the word God or the word Lord. It talks about misusing the name Yahweh. So this commandment is absolutely subjective. The fourth commandment is, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock or the alien resident in your towns. Now, on the surface, this may feel somewhat objective. Keep the Sabbath holy. Remember the Sabbath. But let me remind you that Jews and Christians don't even agree on which day is the Sabbath. Jews recognize Saturday as the Sabbath. Christians recognize Sunday as the Sabbath. Now, when I was a Christian, I probably would have told you that the exact day that you are picking for your Sabbath doesn't matter. If you work 6 days a week and the only day that you get off every week is Tuesday, then reasonable minds could probably tell you that if Tuesday is your Sabbath, that's fine. So maybe it's a bit lawyerly to sit here and quibble over the exact day, but also keep in mind that in the Pentateuch itself, a man was stoned to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. So on one level, it feels like an ancient, out-of-date commandment that maybe we don't need to worry too much about with regard to the specific day of the week. On the other hand, it kind of feels like God puts a lot of stock in it. And the penalties for doing something on the Sabbath are pretty damn severe. So when two major branches of what is essentially the same core religion, or at least worship of the same deity, can't even agree on what day is the Sabbath, that definitely feels subjective to me. But even if we said, fine, the actual day on which you observe the Sabbath doesn't really matter. All that matters is the spirit of observing the Sabbath. This commandment is still dripping with subjectivity, because what exactly is work? As we've already pointed out, apparently, according to the letter of Old Testament law, gathering sticks on the Sabbath is work, and it's worthy of being stoned to death. Now, I know that no modern Christians are going to grab their stones to kill people who are gathering sticks on the Sabbath. But the point here is that this is the antithesis of objective. What is work? What is not? You might sit here as a man in some old school, conservative, patriarchal home, and you might say, I didn't do any work today. In fact, maybe your whole family didn't do any work today. Did your wife prepare a meal? Because if you don't think that that's work, maybe you should ask your wife. The definition of what is work and what is not depends entirely on your subjective viewpoint of work or leisure. So the idea that this commandment is objective in any way is absolutely false. The fifth commandment is, honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Do I even need to explain whether or not the word honor is objective or subjective? I mean, this is a fine commandment. I would tell anyone that when in doubt, honor your parents. Don't be a jerk. Do what they tell you to do, or try to make them happy within reason. And of course, if you're very young, this should be a stronger commandment than if you're, say, 60 and your parents are 90. But what exactly qualifies as honor is, once again, the definition of subjective. If your parents are abusive, are you supposed to just take the abuse? Can you say anything to them about it? Can you refuse to follow their commands? Do you have to go along with all of their suggestions? If your parents don't like the person that you're dating, do you need to cut off that relationship in order to honor your parents? And what is the point in time at which honoring transitions from obeying to simply hearing someone's concerns and taking them into account? There is just no way that you can assume that a command to honor your father and mother is anything but subjective. The sixth commandment is, you shall not murder. This is one of the commandments, along with stealing, that I always find to be a little silly because murdering is, by definition, an unjustified killing. So, as far as I know, every society that has ever existed has allowed, in some form or capacity, killing. Maybe they allow killing in self-defense. Maybe they allow killing as a form of justice. Of course, almost every society allows killing when it is deployed with the power of the state. And the other translations that most of us grew up with, translations like the King James Version, often had here for this commandment that you shall not kill. And that always twisted my head into knots when I was a kid because our King James Version said, thou shalt not kill. And yet the Bible was replete with killing by all of the characters of the Bible, killing as commanded by God to do to the enemies of the Bible, killing as done directly by God, usually in capricious and over-the-top means. But killing was all over the place. It wasn't until I got older that I realized that thou shalt not kill is a pretty crappy translation. And now, unless you're using something like an old King James Version, you probably do see here that it says you shall not murder. And murder is a much more effective command than thou shalt not kill because it doesn't come with all of the odd complexities of saying thou shalt not kill inside a book that is littered with killing left and right. But like I said, the idea that you can't murder, I mean, fine, I agree. You shouldn't murder because murdering is by definition an unjustified killing. The problem here is that it never defines what is murder. It never makes any attempt to say if something is justified, which means it would not be murder, or whether it is truly an unjustified killing, which would be murder. And as you probably know, the standard from one society to the next, and even within the same society over time, changes wildly as to what is considered murder and what is not. So there is no logical way that you can tell me you shall not murder without any further context is possibly an objective standard. It simply is not. The seventh command is you shall not commit adultery. Now that sounds pretty simple, right? That's got to be objective. Don't screw your friend's wife. Don't screw your friend's husband. In fact, don't screw anyone who is not your spouse. Don't commit adultery. That's got to be pretty objective, right? Well, not really. Jesus taught us that to lust after someone else was essentially creating adultery in your mind. But this is mentioned nowhere in the Old Testament. So if you have looked at anyone and thought, I'd get me some of that, I sure do like that person, then have you committed adultery or not? Some people would say yes. Some people would say no. And even if you go by the full Jesus definition of this, if it is completely in conflict with the plain text that we got from the original 10 Commandments, then you can't really say that the Bible itself and that Christian morals in general are objective. Let me put that to you in a simpler way. If one part of the book says X and the other part of the book says Y, then that is not an objective standard. Those are conflicting standards, and you cannot tell me that's objective. But even beyond the super interpretation that was put on this by Jesus, let's throw that aside for a second. If you're a dude who is married to a woman, go ask your wife if she thinks it is adultery if you go out tonight and buy yourself a prostitute and have sex with that prostitute. I bet that your wife would consider that to be adultery. But by the standards put forward in your Old Testament, it sure as hell is not. See, the commandment here to not commit adultery may seem very simple if reading simply from the 10 Commandments. But we know from all of the context of the Pentateuch itself and the Bible in general, but especially in the Pentateuch, that committing adultery was either horrible and punishable by death, or it wasn't even a crime. It just depends on what your gender was, and it depends on what parties were doing the adultering. In other words, If a married man went out and had sex with a single woman, that was not adultery, because it wasn't considered adultery to step out on your own wife, and there wasn't a problem with sleeping with this single woman. Now, societally speaking, there was a problem on the woman's part, because the woman always gets blamed for this, but it wasn't considered a problem for a man to do this. Now, if you were a married man and you went out and slept with another man's wife, that was a huge problem. Not because you had committed adultery with any woman, but because you had committed adultery with this other man's property. That's why it was such a sin if you went out and slept with another man's wife. But you could go out as a man and go get yourself a prostitute, and that was fine, because that prostitute was not another man's property. And if you flip this around and the woman went out and slept with anyone, that was absolutely unforgivable and could not be tolerated, because women were the property of their husband. So for a woman to go out and sleep with a single man, or to sleep with a married man, or to sleep with a male prostitute or whatever, it didn't matter. That was all considered an egregious sin. So the standards here are absolutely inconsistent, and this idea that we get throughout the Pentateuch of committing adultery is absolutely subjective. The eighth commandment is, "You shall not steal." Now, this is very similar to the commandment that says, "You shall not murder," meaning that every society that I've ever heard of has some type of laws or punishments for an unjustified taking, which is what stealing is. On a similar note, there are almost always scenarios in which you are justified in taking things. So stealing, by definition, is an unjustified taking. And whether you have a commandment against it or not in your holy book, the simple fact is that no one ever justifies an unjustified taking. So that is where the ambiguity comes in. It's not that the commandment says, "You shall not take," because there are always scenarios in any society where it is considered justified for you to take something. For example, if it's already established that someone took something from you, it's usually understood that you have the right to take it back. But there are many other scenarios where takings are considered to be normal and justified. The question becomes, what makes a taking justified and what makes it unjustified? Because that's what determines whether or not it is a repossession or whether it is a theft. And that distinction between seizing or repossessing versus theft is different, at the edges at least, from every society throughout the world, and even within every society as time goes by. Those laws change, they grow and morph and recede, and what was called theft in the 1700s in your city may not even be called theft today, and what you don't call theft today might be considered theft 100 years from now. So the commandment that "you shall not steal," while it is very simple in nature and may feel objective to you Christians out there, it is anything but. The ninth commandment is, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." The simpler version that we normally heard is, "Thou shalt not lie." But this more verbose version really spells out some key problems. First, I want to point out the last part of the sentence, "against your neighbor." I brought this up in my God-Free Bible Study episode, which will be airing in a couple weeks, that covers this same verse. But why is it that they put in here, "against your neighbor"? What's wrong with just saying, "Hey, don't lie, bro"? But instead, it's saying, "against your neighbor." Now, I don't know this for a fact. A biblical scholar may be able to shine some more significant light on this. But so many of the laws that were handed down in the Pentateuch have varying standards for what you can do against your fellow Hebrews or Israelites versus what you can do to foreigners. So I really believe that "against your neighbor" here is a subtle nod to the fact that you shouldn't be lying against other Hebrews or against other Israelites. But if you go lie to the Canaanites, I don't know if God really cares about that. Now, it doesn't say that explicitly. You could read your neighbor to be this Jesus type statement about everyone is our neighbor and do unto others as you would have them do unto you, etc., etc., etc. But it feels really weird that you would put your neighbor in here when you could just say, hey, don't bear false witness. But even if we take out the neighbor ambiguity, all right, bearing false witness, well, we all know that there are lies, there are white lies, there's propaganda, there's political effery. I mean, there's all sorts of different untruths. Now, I guess if you wanted to, you could read this as an absolute statement that you should never, ever let a single word come out of your mouth that is ever anything less than 100% true. But that really makes no sense. Not only because humans are humans and white lies sometimes are absolutely not a bad thing, but more importantly, God himself lies. The first thing that God ever said in the Bible when he was talking to them in the Garden of Eden was a lie. He said that if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die this day. He didn't say you will die eventually, or he didn't say you will bring death into the world. He said that you will die this day. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was a lie. After he works up his whole let my people go scheme with Moses, the first thing that Moses does when he comes and talks to the Pharaoh is that he gives him a lie. He says, you need to let our people go into the wilderness to attend a festival for the Lord, to worship the Lord, that we're only going to be gone for several days. That was a lie. The plan, as handed down from God himself on the mountain to Moses at the burning bush, was to extract those Israelites from Egypt permanently. And yet they start this whole dance with Pharaoh as a lie. And yes, it was Moses and or Aaron who was saying these things directly to the Pharaoh, but he was saying them as a spokesperson for God. So again, this idea that you simply cannot lie at all beggars credulity. And I cannot possibly take this commandment as being anything other than subjective. The 9th commandment is, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, like I said with the previous commandment, my first bit of ambiguity around this commandment is the inclusion of your neighbor. Because if the idea is that being covetous is sinful and destructive to us, then why is it only limited to my neighbor? Now, I don't believe that they were only referring to your neighbor in a 21st century perspective, like the person who lives to the right or left of you on your street. But I don't believe that the limitation to your neighbor meant all of humanity, because I don't think God cared less if you coveted something that was owned by the Canaanites or the Philistines or the Amalekites, or any of the other enemies that God pitted the Israelites against. So I can't possibly tell you that this is a blanket statement against all covetous behavior, although that is a subjective judgment. More importantly, what does it really mean to covet? I mean, only you can say, and maybe you can't say with certainty, but only you can say whether or not you have truly coveted something. I can look at my neighbor's house or my neighbor's wife or anything else owned by my neighbor, to use Old Testament terminology, and I could say, he's got some nice stuff. I really like it. I could spend some time admiring it. Am I coveting it? Who knows? The idea of what exactly constitutes coveting is truly a subjective judgment. If I just mention in passing that my neighbor has a beautiful car, have I coveted that car? Have I done something that has violated this commandment in any way? If I sit outside my house sometimes with a nice drink and I look at my neighbor's car and I think, damn, that's a nice car, am I coveting it? I'm not sure. I'm sure reasonable minds could say that at a certain point, it crosses a line. If I become obsessed with my neighbor's car or my neighbor's wife or my neighbor's slaves, then at that point, it would probably be violating this command. But the exact moment it crosses the line from just being admiration to being covetous is the definition of subjectivity. So there is no way that we can call this commandment objective. We just can't. So there you have it. Those are all of the vaunted 10 commandments, the objective moral standards of God, except none of them are actually objective. Every single one of them has at least some ambiguity, some subjectivity in them. Some of them, most of them, are nothing but subjectivity. To say that any of this is an objective standard of morality exposes the fact that you just don't know what the word objective means. And even if all of these were written down like legal code, like they covered every what if scenario, even if the language was etched in stone, pun intended, even then it's still subjective, because guess what? You can tell me that you had a dream last night, that God told you that the second commandment or the fifth commandment or whatever no longer applies. And unless someone can prove you wrong, and of course they cannot, then that commandment, at least for you, completely flies out the window. That is the definition of subjectivity. The only thing that you can possibly say about any of this that is objective in any way is that it objectively comes from your make-believe God. But you can't actually prove that these won't change tomorrow when God gives you new commands. So even if these were written in a much clearer and more concrete way, they would be dangerously subjective. But in the way that they're written, they don't even approach any standard of objectivity. They are all the legal equivalent of a Rorschach test. When we read the 10 Commandments, when you read them, when I read them, everyone interprets them through their own lens, their own subjective lens. The things that you were taught from your upbringing, from your time in Sunday school, from your pastor, from your parents, they have instructed you how to interpret these commandments. That does not, by any stretch, actually make the commandments objective. Just because you feel that you have a concrete way by which you can interpret all of these commands doesn't make them objective. They are still objective only from the perspective that they fit into your subjective worldview. That is the definition of subjectivity. Thank you once again for joining me here on my channel, Skepticus. I have to give a few shout outs. First of all, I want to thank Leontios, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your username, but Leon is my first member. I have not done anything to advertise memberships. Memberships just went live days ago. I'm going to be providing more information about this in an upcoming video soon. But thank you to Leon for signing up at my Voltaire level, and I promise to send you more information about this coming up soon. I also want to give a heartfelt thank you to Mike 53B and to Melissa Little 4369 for sending me super thanks. I love money, so thank you very much for that. But seriously, your support is greatly appreciated, and I am very glad that you are along for the ride. I hope that the rest of you have enjoyed this content. I hope to see you on future videos. But until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.